Welcome to Cafe Stories, where every story is a new mystery waiting to be solved. Grab a coffee, stay curious, and share the thrill with fellow mystery lovers. Let's get started. Miss Marple and the Mystery of Murderer's Mirror. Chapter 1. A Matter of Reflection. Miss Jane Marple was trimming her prized white roses when the letter arrived. The morning had been particularly pleasant, with just enough cloud cover to prevent the late summer sun from becoming oppressive. She had been considering whether the upcoming village fete might benefit from a display of her Queen Mary roses when she heard the distinctive crunch of gravel beneath the postman's bicycle. "Morning, Miss Marple," young Tom called out, waving a cream-coloured envelope. "It looks rather fancy, if you don't mind my saying." Miss Marple accepted the letter with a gentle smile, noting the quality of the paper and the familiar, elegant handwriting. "Thank you, Tom. And how is your mother's rheumatism?" "Much better since trying that willow bark tea you suggested, miss." After a brief exchange about his mother's health, Miss Marple returned to her garden bench, letter opener in hand. The envelope contained a single sheet of expensive stationery bearing the embossed header of Ravenscrest Manor. "My dearest Jane, I find myself in need of your particular insight into matters of a disturbing nature. Strange incidents have been occurring at Ravenscrest, all involving mirrors, and I cannot shake the feeling that something terrible is about to happen. I would be most grateful if you could come and stay for a few days. Your presence would be a great comfort. Your old friend, Patricia Dunbar." Miss Marple folded the letter thoughtfully. Lady Patricia was not one for exaggeration or flights of fancy, quite unlike poor Mrs. Symington, who had once convinced herself that her cat was plotting against her, only to discover the animal had simply developed a fondness for sleeping in her newly delivered hat boxes. Within 2 hours, Miss Marple had packed her small valise and was seated on the train to Hampshire. The journey gave her ample time to reflect on Lady Patricia, whom she had known since their school days at Miss Watkins' Academy for Young Ladies. Patricia had always possessed a level head, even when Elizabeth Charteris had tried to convince everyone that the school's east wing was haunted by the ghost of a jilted governess. Ravenscrest Manor emerged from the afternoon mist like a charcoal sketch coming into focus. The Gothic Revival mansion, with its pointed arches and ornate stonework, had always struck Miss Marple as somewhat theatrical, rather like Mrs. Ellington's new house in the village, though on a grander scale, of course. Mr. Collins, the butler, greeted her at the door with proper formality. "Lady Patricia is in the morning-room, miss. She asked to be informed of your arrival immediately." As Miss Marple followed Collins through the hallway, she noticed something odd about the mirrors they passed. Each one had been recently cleaned. She could smell the polish, yet they seemed to have been placed at slightly unusual angles. It reminded her of the time young Bobby Jenkins had rearranged all the mirrors in his mother's dress shop to try to create an infinite reflection, causing quite a stir among the customers. Lady Patricia rose to greet her as she entered the morning room. Though still handsome, her old friend had aged considerably since their last meeting, and there was a nervous energy about her that Miss Marple found troubling. "Jane, my dear friend, thank you for coming so quickly." Lady Patricia gestured to a comfortable chair near the fireplace. "Collins, tea, please, and do be careful with the silver service." Once Collins had departed, Lady Patricia leaned forward. "The most peculiar things have been happening, Jane. Last week I saw a figure in the gallery mirror that vanished when I turned around. Then Edward, my nephew, insisted that his study mirror had been moved, though none of the servants admitted to touching it. And just yesterday I heard the most dreadful crash from the blue room, only to find the mirror there had somehow fallen despite being securely mounted for decades. Miss Marple listened carefully, her fingers absently working at a piece of knitting she had drawn from her bag. And Edward? How has he been affected by these occurrences? He claims I'm imagining things, says it's all coincidence and old houses settle in strange ways, but... Lady Patricia broke off as Collins returned with the tea. The crash when it came was so violent that Miss Marple's teacup rattled in its saucer. It had come from above, followed by a woman's scream. "That's from Edward's study!" Lady Patricia exclaimed, already rising. They found a small crowd gathered outside the study door. Margaret Dunbar, Edward's cousin, was pounding on the heavy oak panel. "Edward! Edward! Please open the door!" "It's locked from the inside, my lady," Collins reported, his usual composure slightly ruffled, "and Mr. Edward isn't answering." "Break it down," Lady Patricia ordered, her voice sharp with fear. It took Collins and Thomas Fletcher, the gardener, 3 attempts to force the door. As it burst open, Miss Marple observed 3 things in quick succession: the afternoon sun streaming through the window at an unusual angle, a large mirror lying shattered on the Turkish carpet, and Edward Dunbar's body sprawled across his desk, a dark stain spreading across his back. As the others rushed forward, Miss Marple remained in the doorway, her faded blue eyes taking in every detail. She noticed how the remaining mirrors in the room seemed to multiply the scene, creating a kaleidoscope of horror. But more interesting to her was the way Collins glanced at the window, just for a moment, before turning his attention to the body. It reminded her rather of something she had once observed at a magic show in the village hall. But that, she decided, could wait. For now there was a dead man in a locked room, a murder weapon that was nowhere to be found, and a household full of people with secrets to keep. Miss Marple sighed softly. It seemed her quiet week of rose-tending would have to wait. Chapter 2. 7 Years' Bad Luck. Inspector Slack arrived at Ravenscrest Manor with the air of a man who expected to find nothing of consequence. Miss Marple recognized his expression. It was the same one he had worn during that business with the vicar's missing manuscript, just before she had pointed out the significance of the altered newspaper dates. "Ah," he said, catching sight of her. "Miss Marple, I might have known." "Good evening, Inspector," Miss Marple replied mildly, her knitting needles clicking steadily. She had positioned herself in a corner of the drawing-room where she could observe the proceedings without appearing to do so. Dr. Harrison had already pronounced Edward Dunbar dead. Between 3 and 4 this afternoon, I should say. And the body had been removed, though the shattered mirror remained where it had fallen, each fragment reflecting the late afternoon sun. "The door was locked from the inside?" Inspector Slack demanded of Collins. "Yes, sir," the butler replied. His composure had returned, though Miss Marple noticed he kept his eyes carefully away from the mirrors. "Mr. Edward frequently locked himself in when working on estate matters." "And where were you at the time of death?" "Polishing the silver in the butler's pantry, sir, as I do every Thursday afternoon." Miss Marple's needles paused momentarily. There was something about the way Collins spoke of his schedule. It reminded her rather of Mrs. Ellsworth's new parlour-maid, who had been so particular about cleaning the brass on Wednesdays. Lady Patricia entered the room, supported by her niece Margaret. The girl's eyes were red, but she had maintained her composure admirably for one who had lost both cousin and secret fiancé in a single afternoon. "I suppose you'll want to know about the art collection," Lady Patricia said wearily, lowering herself into a chair. "Since that's what all this trouble has been about." Inspector Slack's eyebrows rose. "The art collection, Lady Patricia." "Edward announced his intentions to sell it," Just last week, Margaret explained, her voice barely above a whisper. The entire Dunbar collection, paintings that have been in the family for generations. Over my objections, Lady Patricia added sharply. The collection belongs to Ravenscrest. To sell it would be to sell our heritage. Miss Marple observed the way Margaret's hands twisted in her lap at these words. The girl's engagement ring was conspicuously absent, though there was a telling pale band on her finger. Did many people know of Mr. Dunbar's intentions? Inspector Slack inquired. The entire household, Collins offered. Mr. Edward made quite an announcement of it at dinner last Thursday. He had already contacted Christie's about an evaluation. And what was the general reaction to this news? There was considerable upset, sir. Collins glanced at Lady Patricia. The staff has as much pride in Ravenscrest's treasures as the family. Miss Marple thought of young Fred Timkins at the post office, who had been so distressed when his grandmother's china was sold. Though in that case, as it turned out, his distress had more to do with what had been hidden inside the teapot than any sentimental attachment. "Tell him about the mirrors, Patricia," Margaret urged suddenly, "about all the strange things that have been happening." Lady Patricia recounted the incidents she had described to Miss Marple earlier. Inspector Slack listened with poorly concealed scepticism. "Coincidences," he pronounced. "Old houses are full of them. What interests me more is where everyone was between 3 and 4 o'clock this afternoon. The alibis came quickly enough." Lady Patricia had been taking her afternoon rest, as verified by her maid. Margaret had been in the garden, though she admitted no one had seen her there. Collins, as he had said, had been polishing the silver. Thomas Fletcher had been pruning the topiary, witnessed by both the second gardener and the scullery maid, who had been hanging out washing. "And the other servants?" Slack pressed. "Mrs. Graves, the housekeeper, was inventorying the linen cupboard," Collins replied. "Alice Bennet was cleaning the blue room mirrors and—" "The mirrors again," Slack interrupted. "Why are there so many mirrors being cleaned lately?" A slight pause. "Mr. Edward's orders, sir," Collins explained. "He had all the mirrors in the house cleaned and adjusted last week. Said something about the light not being quite right." Miss Marple's knitting needles stilled completely. "How curious," she murmured. "It puts one in mind of the mirrors at the village hall just before the magic show last summer, though in that case, of course, the positioning was quite deliberate." Inspector Slack ignored her comment, but Miss Marple noticed Margaret's slight start at the mention of magic shows. "I'll need to speak with everyone individually," Slack announced. "Starting with you, Lady Patricia, and I'll want a complete inventory of this art collection that caused so much trouble." As the inspector led Lady Patricia away, Miss Marple observed Colin straightening a small mirror in the corner of the room. His movements were precise, practiced, rather too practiced, for an ordinary butler, she thought. It reminded her of something, though she couldn't quite place what. "Miss Marple," Margaret said suddenly, crossing to her corner, "do you really think there might be a connection between Edward's death and all these strange happenings with the mirrors?" "My dear," Miss Marple replied gently, "in my experience, when unusual things begin to occur in a household, they very rarely happen by chance. I remember a case in the village, the postmistress's nephew who started receiving such odd letters. Everyone thought it was just a coincidence until we realized the letters were coming on very specific days for a very specific reason." Margaret's face paled slightly. "But surely you don't think—" She broke off as Collins re-entered with tea. Miss Marple noticed how his gaze lingered on the mirror he had just adjusted, checking its angle with what seemed to her a rather professional eye. "7 years bad luck," he remarked, nodding at the shattered mirror in the study above. "Or so they say." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. "Though in my experience, Mr. Collins, bad luck rarely happens entirely by chance." Something flickered in the butler's eyes, something that reminded Miss Marple rather sharply of a performer she had once seen at a seaside pier, just before he made a lady's necklace disappear. Chapter 3. Smoke and Mirrors. The morning after Edward Dunbar's death dawned grey and oppressive. Miss Marple sat in Ravenscrest Manor's breakfast-room, observing the interplay of light and shadow across the wall of mirrors that lined one side of the chamber. She had risen early, hoping to observe the household's morning routine, and was not disappointed. Collins entered precisely at 8 o'clock to serve breakfast. His movements were methodical as he arranged the silver coffee service, though Miss Marple noticed his usual efficiency was somewhat disturbed when passing the mirrors. "I trust you slept well, miss?" he inquired. "Oh yes, thank you," Miss Marple replied, "though I did notice something rather peculiar about the mirror in my room. The angle seems to have been adjusted recently." Collins's hand paused momentarily as he poured the coffee. "As I mentioned to Inspector Slack, Mr. Edward had all the mirrors adjusted last week. Something about the light, he said. How particular he must have been about such things." "Indeed, miss. Mr. Edward was most precise in his instructions about the positioning, rather like taking measurements for a stage setting," he said. Miss Marple's needles clicked thoughtfully. The reference to stage settings reminded her of something, though she couldn't quite place what. Lady Patricia joined them, looking drawn and tired. "I've hardly slept," she announced, settling into her chair. "Those mirrors, I keep seeing things in them. Reflections that don't quite match." "The mind can play curious tricks when we're distressed," Miss Marple said gently. "I remember poor Mrs. Symington, after her husband's passing. She was quite convinced she saw him in every window." Collins moved quietly around the room, adjusting curtains and straightening items on the sideboard. Miss Marple observed how his reflection multiplied in the wall of mirrors, creating a curious kaleidoscope effect. "I suppose we must discuss the art collection," Lady Patricia said heavily. "Inspector Slack will want details. Edward had been in contact with several dealers." She paused, glancing at Collins. "That will be all for now, Collins. I'll ring if we need anything." Once the butler had departed, Lady Patricia leaned forward. "Jane, there's something you should know about Edward and Margaret." "They were engaged?" Miss Marple suggested quietly. Lady Patricia's eyes widened. "How did you—" "The pale band on her finger, my dear, and the way she touched the locket she wears, rather like young Sally Turner when she was secretly engaged to the bank clerk." "Yes, they were engaged. Had been for 3 months, but they kept it quiet because—" Lady Patricia hesitated. "Well, because of the art collection, you see. Edward knew I disapproved of selling it, but he needed the money. He was in debt, though he tried to hide it. The sale would have cleared his obligations, but it would have left Margaret with nothing to inherit." "I see," Miss Marple murmured. "And how did Margaret feel about this arrangement?" "She was torn, naturally. The collection means as much to her as it does to me. But she loved Edward. Though lately—" Lady Patricia twisted her handkerchief. "Lately there had been arguments. I heard them quarrelling in the gallery just yesterday morning." Miss Marple's knitting paused. "The gallery with the mirrors?" "Yes." Edward was gesturing at them, quite agitated. Something about angles and measurements. Margaret left in tears. Their conversation was interrupted by a crash from upstairs, followed by hurried footsteps. Alice Bennet, the maid, appeared in the doorway, her face white. "Begging your pardon, my lady, but it's happened again. The mirror in the blue room, it's fallen just like before." Lady Patricia rose quickly. "Was anyone hurt?" "No, my lady, but—" Alice glanced nervously at the wall of mirrors. "Just before it fell, I saw something in it. A figure like the one you mentioned seeing. Only—" She swallowed hard. "Only it looked like Mr. Edward." Miss Marple observed the girl's genuine terror. "You were cleaning the mirror at the time?" "No, miss. I was just finishing the dusting. But I did clean all the mirrors yesterday morning, as Mr. Collins instructed. He was very particular about the polish I was to use." "The polish?" Miss Marple's voice sharpened slightly. "Yes, miss." "A special kind Mr. Edward had ordered. Mr. Collins said it had to be applied in a specific way, in a certain pattern. Rather odd it was." Lady Patricia had already started for the door. "We must see this at once, though I'm sure Inspector Slack will say it's just another coincidence." As they climbed the stairs, Miss Marple remembered something that had been nagging at her. "Lady Patricia, you mentioned Edward was in debt. Do you know to whom?" "Not entirely, though Collins might know more. Edward often discussed financial matters with him. He trusted Collins completely. They had quite a rapport, especially after Collins helped him arrange that magic show for the village fete last summer." Miss Marple stopped abruptly on the stairs. "A magic show, with mirrors, perhaps?" "Why, yes, quite elaborate it was. Collins seemed to know a great deal about it. Said his grandfather had been an illusionist or some such thing." Miss Marple said nothing, but her fingers moved to her knitting bag, where she kept the morning's newspaper. She had noticed something in the theatrical notices, something about a famous Victorian illusionist's props being sold at auction. The timing seemed rather significant. They reached the blue room to find Collins already there, carefully sweeping up fragments of the shattered mirror. Miss Marple noticed how he gathered each piece with peculiar care, almost as if— "Oh dear," she said softly to herself. "Of course. How very clever. Rather like the trick with Colonel Bantry's pocket watch, though this is far more elaborate." She looked up to find Collins watching her, his face carefully blank. But in the remaining mirrors that lined the room, she caught a fleeting expression in his reflection, one that confirmed her growing suspicions about the truth behind Edward Dunbar's death. Chapter 4. Through the Looking-Glass. The afternoon found Miss Marple taking tea with Mrs. Graves, the housekeeper, in the latter's cosy sitting-room. Unlike the rest of Ravenscrest Manor, this space was mercifully free of mirrors, containing only a small looking-glass above the fireplace. "The house has its secrets," Mrs. Graves said, pouring tea with a steady hand. "All these old places do, but Ravenscrest's secrets are different." "Different in what way?" Miss Marple inquired, her knitting needles moving steadily. "It's the mirrors, you see. They're part of the house's history. When Sebastian Vale owned it—" "Sebastian Vale?" Miss Marple's needles paused. "The illusionist. Owned Ravenscrest in the 1860s. They called him the Mirror Master. He was famous for his illusions." Mrs. Graves lowered her voice. "They say he built secret passages throughout the house, cleverly hidden behind the mirrors. Mr. Edward was fascinated by the stories, spent hours in the library researching Vale's history." Miss Marple thought of the newspaper notice about the Victorian illusionist's props. "And did he find anything of interest?" "Oh yes, old plans, diagrams. He was particularly interested in Vale's final illusion, something called the Murderer's Mirror. Vale died before he could perform it." Mrs. Graves glanced at her own small mirror. "They say that's what brought the curse." "Curse?" 7 generations of misfortune caused by Vale's obsession with mirrors. Though that's just servants' talk, of course. She hesitated. "But Alice, the maid who died this morning, she believed it." Miss Marple's head snapped up. Died? Found at the bottom of the service stairs, poor girl. Dr. Harrison says she must have fallen, though I don't see how. Alice knew those stairs like the back of her hand. Miss Marple remembered Alice's pale face as she'd described seeing Edward's reflection. She mentioned seeing something in the mirror yesterday. Yes, Mrs. Graves said quietly. She came to me, quite upset. Said she'd seen something strange while cleaning the study mirror, a flash of movement that didn't match any of the reflections. She wanted to tell Inspector Slack, but Mr. Collins said she was just imagining things. Miss Marple's fingers tightened on her knitting. What time was this? Just before dinner. She'd been cleaning the mirrors all afternoon. Mr. Collins was most particular about it being done yesterday. Said the angle of the light had to be just right. The clicking of needles slowed as Miss Marple absorbed this information. It reminded her of something, a case involving the church treasurer and a carefully timed deception, though this was far more elaborate. Mrs. Graves, she said carefully, you mentioned Mr. Edward's research into Sebastian Vale. Did he share his findings with anyone? With Mr. Collins, mainly. They spent hours discussing it. Collins seemed to know a great deal about Victorian illusions, said his grandfather had been in the trade. Mrs. Graves paused. Though now I think of it, he never mentioned which grandfather or what his name had been. A knock at the door interrupted them. Thomas Fletcher, the gardener, stood in the doorway, his cap in his hands. Begging your pardon, Mrs. Graves, but there's something you should see. In the old garden house. They followed Fletcher across the grounds, to a weathered structure almost hidden by ivy. Inside, dust sheets covered what appeared to be furniture, but when Fletcher pulled back one corner, Miss Marple caught the glint of glass. Mirrors, Fletcher explained. Dozens of them. Found them when I was clearing the ivy. Some have dates carved in the frames, from the 1860s. And look at this. He handed Miss Marple a tarnished brass plate. Engraved on it were the words, Property of S. Vale, Esquire, for use in final performance only. Most curious, Miss Marple murmured. And when did you make this discovery, Mr. Fletcher? Last Thursday. Told Mr. Edward about it straight away. He was proper excited. Came out here with Mr. Collins to look everything over. They spent hours measuring and making notes. Thursday, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. The same day Mr. Edward announced his plans to sell the art collection. She examined one of the mirrors more closely. Its surface was clouded with age, but she could make out strange markings etched into the glass, angles and measurements precisely calculated. Mr. Fletcher, she said suddenly, from here, can one see into Mr. Edward's study? Aye, miss. Clear view of the window, especially when the sun's at the right angle. See for yourself. Miss Marple moved to where he pointed. Through a gap in the ivy she could indeed see the study window. The afternoon sun struck it directly, creating a brilliant reflection that— "Oh dear," she said softly. "Of course, how very ingenious, though not quite as ingenious as Sebastian Vale intended, I imagine." A movement caught her eye. Collins crossing the lawn toward the house. As he passed the garden house, his head turned slightly, and Miss Marple saw his reflection in one of the uncovered mirrors. For a moment, the angle of the light made it seem as though there were two of him, walking in slightly different directions. She thought of poor Alice Bennet, seeing something in the mirror that didn't match any of the reflections. The girl had witnessed something she wasn't meant to see, something that had cost Edward Dunbar his life, and now her own. "Mr. Fletcher," Miss Marple said, her voice carefully casual. Would you be so kind as to help me carry one of these smaller mirrors back to the house? I should like to show it to Inspector Slack, though perhaps we shouldn't mention it to Mr. Collins just yet." As they made their way back, Miss Marple glanced at the study window again. The sun had shifted, and now the glass showed only ordinary reflections. But she had seen enough to understand how Edward Dunbar had died, and why the timing of the mirror cleaning had been so very important. In her mind, she began to compose a telegram to Sir Henry Clithering. There were questions about Sebastian Vale that needed answering, and quickly. Before any more accidents could occur in Ravenscrest's mirrors. Chapter 5. Reflections of Truth. Inspector Slack stood in Edward Dunbar's study, his expression darkening as he examined the small mirror Miss Marple had brought from the garden house. "Theatrical nonsense," he declared, setting it aside dismissively. "I won't have this investigation derailed by magic tricks and superstitions about cursed mirrors." Miss Marple, who had been examining the angle of sunlight falling across the room, merely smiled. She had set aside her knitting for the moment, finding it more useful to watch how the light played across the newly cleaned glass surfaces. "The facts are simple," Slack continued. "Edward Dunbar was murdered in a locked room. Now the maid who worked in that room is dead. No ghosts, no curses, and just straightforward crime." "Oh, I quite agree, Inspector," Miss Marple said mildly. "Though I wouldn't say it was straightforward at all. Rather like that case at the village fete last summer when everyone thought the disappearing ring trick was magic, until we realized it was actually quite a clever use of mirrors and timing." Slack ignored her, as she had expected he would. "The receipt we found in Mr. Dunbar's desk. Specialized glass, ordered from London, delivered last Thursday. Same day he announced the sale of the art collection. That can't be coincidence." "Indeed not," Miss Marple agreed. "Though perhaps not for the reasons you might think." She moved to the window, careful to stay out of the direct sunlight. From this position, she could just see the old garden house through the trees. Thomas Fletcher was working nearby, though she noticed he kept his distance from the ivy-covered structure. Margaret Dunbar appeared in the doorway, pale but composed. "Inspector, the inventory of the art collection you requested." She held out a thick folder. "Edward kept meticulous records." "Including valuations?" Slack asked sharply. "Yes." The Christie's representative had been here just last week. She hesitated. "The collection is worth considerably more than anyone realized." "Enough to clear Edward's debt several times over." Miss Marple observed how Margaret's hand trembled slightly as she handed over the folder. "My dear," she said gently, "might we have a little talk? Perhaps in the garden?" The garden proved illuminating, though not in the way young Margaret might have expected. As they walked, Miss Marple noted how the angle of the sun created strange patterns through the trees, patterns that would have been quite different at 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon. "Edward was so excited when they found those old mirrors," Margaret said suddenly. "He and Collins spent hours studying them. Edward said they were the key to understanding Sebastian Vale's final illusion." "The murderer's mirror?" Miss Marple inquired. "Yes. Edward found Vale's original plans in the library. He said it was ingenious, something about multiple reflections creating impossible angles. He tried to explain it to me, but—" She twisted her handkerchief. "I'm afraid I wasn't very interested. I was too upset about the art collection." "Quite understandable," Miss Marple said. "Though I expect Mr. Collins understood perfectly." Margaret's step faltered. "Collins?" "Well, yes, he seemed to grasp it immediately, almost as if—" She broke off, frowning. "Almost as if he already knew," Miss Marple suggested. Before Margaret could respond, they heard quick footsteps on the gravel path. Collins approached, his usual composure slightly ruffled. "Excuse me, miss, but Inspector Slack is asking for Miss Dunbar." Something about signatures on the Christie's documents. As Margaret hurried away, Miss Marple noticed how Collins's eyes followed her, not directly, but in the reflection of a garden ornament's polished surface. The angle was quite precise. "Such a tragedy about Alice Bennet," Miss Marple remarked. "She was quite good at cleaning mirrors, I understand." "She was competent enough," Collins replied stiffly, though she didn't always understand the importance of proper technique. Miss Marple smiled gently. "Yes, technique can be so important in these matters, particularly when timing is involved." A shadow passed across the garden as a cloud obscured the sun. In that moment, Miss Marple saw something shift in Collins's expression. A calculation, quick but unmistakable. "If you'll excuse me, miss," he said smoothly, "I believe Lady Patricia will be wanting her afternoon tea." Miss Marple watched him go, noting how he moved between the reflected surfaces of windows and garden ornaments with practiced ease. She thought of the receipt Inspector Slack had found, not for ordinary glass, but for something quite specific. Something that, when combined with antique mirrors and precisely calculated angles, could create a most remarkable effect. "I suppose," she murmured to herself, "one really ought to telegram Sir Henry again, though this time perhaps about the family history rather than the mirrors themselves." She reached for her knitting bag, then stopped. Through the study window above, she could see Inspector Slack examining the room's angles with a measuring tape. He was going about it quite wrong, of course. The important measurements weren't in the room itself, but in the careful arrangement of reflecting surfaces that led to it. Rather like the trick she had once seen demonstrated at a London theatre, though this version had been adapted for a far darker purpose. The question now was whether she could prove it before anyone else discovered what Alice Bennet had seen in that fatal reflection. A flicker of movement caught her eye, Collins passing through the conservatory. For just a moment, as he crossed between two mirrors, his reflection seemed to separate from him, moving in a slightly different direction. Most people would have dismissed it as a trick of the light, but Miss Marple knew better. Chapter 6. A Fractured Image. Miss Marple had been about to take her morning walk when the telegram from Sir Henry Clithering arrived. His response was swift and illuminating. Vale's theatrical documents had indeed remained at Ravenscrest, specifically in the Manor's library, and his research on mirror illusions had been particularly extensive. Most importantly, Sir Henry had uncovered a crucial detail about Vale's grandson, a detail that changed everything. After reading the telegram several times, Miss Marple made her way to the Manor's vast library, knowing that the answers she sought would be found in Vale's own papers rather than the family's more recent records. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through Ravenscrest Manor's library, as Miss Marple examined the yellowed playbill she had discovered tucked between the pages of an old theatre guide. The document, dated 1868, advertised Sebastian Vale's final performance, The Murderer's Mirror, an illusion of death. Lady Patricia entered, looking more tired than ever. Lady Patricia said, sinking into a chair. They seemed to think she might have had something to do with Edward's death. As if she could have managed such a thing in a locked room. "The locked room is precisely what interests me," Miss Marple replied. "Have you noticed how the sunlight strikes the study window at exactly 4 o'clock? "I try not to look at the mirrors any more," Lady Patricia shuddered. "Not since Alice. Inspector Slack says she must have fallen, but I can't help wondering if she saw something she shouldn't have." Miss Marple moved to the window, studying the garden house in the distance. Tell me about the magic show Edward arranged last summer. That was quite an event. Edward became fascinated with Vale's illusions after discovering some old equipment in the garden house. He spent weeks studying the techniques, the angles, the special mirrors. Lady Patricia frowned, though the final illusion never quite worked as planned. "The impossible murder?" Miss Marple inquired. "Yes, Edward was terribly disappointed. He'd found Vale's original plans and everything." She paused. "That was when he started having financial troubles, you know. The research consumed him." Collins entered with the tea tray, his movements precise and practiced as always. Miss Marple watched his reflection in the library's mirrors as he arranged the cups. "I've been reading about Sebastian Vale's final performance," Miss Marple said. "Such a tragedy that he died before he could present it?" "Indeed, miss," Collins replied, his face impassive. "Will that be all, my lady?" After he departed, Miss Marple returned to the window. The sun was reaching the angle that so interested her, creating complex patterns of light between the garden house and the study above. "Would you happen to know if Edward kept Vale's books on optical illusions?" she asked. "In his study, I believe. Though everything's been disrupted since—" Lady Patricia's voice trailed off. The study had been released by the police, though the shattered mirror remained, its fragments carefully collected in a box. Miss Marple went straight to the bookshelf, finding what she sought almost immediately. A leather-bound volume titled The Principles of Optical Deception. Inside she found diagrams and calculations, all annotated in Edward's hand. But it was the loose paper that fell from between the pages that caught her attention. A series of measurements and angles written in a different, more practiced script. Through the window she could see Inspector Slack examining the garden house. He had dismissed her theories about theatrical illusions, but Miss Marple knew she was right. The murder weapon would have been visible only in reflection, never in the room itself, a variation on Vale's famous mirror trick. She thought of Alice Bennet, seeing something she wasn't meant to see. The maid's death had been no accident, just as Edward's had been carefully planned. The killer had used Vale's principles to create an impossible crime, but had made one crucial mistake. Miss Marple picked up a fragment of the shattered mirror, watching how it caught the light. The secret lay in the angles, in the precise timing of sunlight and shadow. But more than that, it lay in understanding human nature, in knowing how people would react to seeing something impossible. She gathered the papers she had found, tucking them carefully into her bag. Tomorrow, she would need to speak with Thomas Fletcher again about what he had discovered in the garden house, and then, she rather thought, it would be time to arrange a gathering in the study at precisely 4 o'clock, when the sun struck the windows at exactly the right angle. Someone in Ravenscrest Manor had studied Vale's illusions very carefully indeed. Someone who understood mirrors and light, timing and deception. Someone who had taken a theatrical trick and turned it to murder. Miss Marple smiled slightly as she left the study. She had nearly all the pieces now. All that remained was to set the stage for one final performance, one that would reveal not just how Edward Dunbar had died, but why Vale's final illusion had been worth killing for. Chapter 7. A Matter of Timing. The morning room at Ravenscrest Manor possessed a peculiar quality of light just before tea time. Miss Marple, having spent the better part of 2 days observing this phenomenon, had selected this precise hour for what she termed a most necessary gathering. "Upon my word, Jane," Lady Patricia declared, settling into her customary chair, "I cannot fathom why you insist upon having tea served in Edward's study tomorrow. The very thought makes my nerves quite unequal to the task." "I dare say it seems peculiar," Miss Marple replied, arranging her shawl with deliberate care. "But I believe it will prove most illuminating." Margaret Dunbar, who had been standing by the window in that particularly rigid manner of one attempting to maintain composure, turned sharply. "Illuminating? I confess I find your choice of words rather pointed, Miss Marple." "Do you indeed?" Miss Marple's tone was mild, though her eyes held a keenness that belied her gentle demeanour. "How very observant of you, my dear." The door opened with measured precision as Collins entered bearing the tea-tray. "Pardon the interruption, my lady, but Inspector Slack has requested the pleasure of your company in the library." "Oh, must I?" Lady Patricia rose with evident reluctance. "I suppose one cannot refuse the police, even in one's own home. Though I must say, his manner of conducting this investigation leaves much to be desired." After Lady Patricia's departure, Collins began arranging the tea things with that particular exactitude Miss Marple had observed in him from the first. His movements caught the light from the window, creating a curious effect in the room's mirrors. "Shall I pour, miss?" he inquired, his bearing entirely correct. "If you would be so kind," Miss Marple responded. "Though I believe Margaret would prefer her cup by the window. The light there is rather more favourable, would you not agree?" A barely perceptible pause in Collins's movements suggested he had caught her meaning. "As you say, miss." Margaret accepted her cup with trembling hands. "Miss Marple, you mentioned something about a theatrical programme you discovered?" "Indeed, most fascinating, particularly the technical notes regarding Vale's final illusion. One might almost say it was worth killing for, though of course that would depend entirely upon one's perspective." The cup rattled slightly in Margaret's saucer. "I'm sure I don't take your meaning." "Don't you?" Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the mirror above the fireplace. "It's rather like looking at one's reflection, you see. Everything appears exactly as it should unless one knows precisely where to look for the discrepancy." A knock at the door heralded Thomas Fletcher's arrival. The gardener touched his cap respectfully, though Miss Marple noted he kept his distance from the mirrors. "Begging your pardon, miss, but I found something else in the garden house, something as might interest Inspector Slack." "How very providential," Miss Marple remarked. "Though perhaps we should wait until 4 o'clock tomorrow to share your discovery. The light will be more advantageous then." Fletcher's weather-worn face showed understanding. "Aye, miss, the angle of the sun being what it is at that hour." "Quite so." Miss Marple turned to Collins, who had maintained his position by the tea-tray with impeccable propriety. "You'll ensure everything is arranged in the study precisely as I've requested?" "Certainly, miss," Collins replied, his expression perfectly composed. "Though I confess I don't quite understand the purpose of repositioning the remaining mirrors." "Don't you? How very curious. I should have thought you, of all people, would appreciate the importance of proper alignment in these matters." Margaret set her cup down with sudden decision. "Miss Marple, I feel I must tell you something about Edward's research into the Vale illusions." "Tomorrow, my dear," Miss Marple said gently. "Some revelations require the proper setting, wouldn't you agree? Now, Mr. Fletcher, about that item you discovered, I trust you've left it exactly where you found it?" "Just as you asked, miss, wrapped in the velvet cloth, hidden behind the third mirror from the left." Collins's reflection in the mirror showed a momentary tension, though his actual countenance remained unperturbed. "Will that be all, miss?" "The silver requires attention before tomorrow's gathering." "By all means," Miss Marple smiled. "Though do be careful with the polish. Such materials can be quite treacherous when improperly handled." After Collins's departure, Margaret moved closer to Miss Marple's chair. "You know something, don't you, about Edward's death?" and poor Alice's. After Collins's departure, Margaret moved closer to Miss Marple's chair. "You know something, don't you, about Edward's death and poor Alice's?" "Knowledge, my dear, is rather like a reflection. One must examine it from multiple angles to perceive the truth." Miss Marple began gathering her things. "I suggest you take particular care until tomorrow's gathering. Mirrors can be dangerous things when secrets are at stake." "But surely you don't think—" Margaret began. "I think, my dear, that tomorrow at 4 o'clock we shall witness a most remarkable demonstration of Vale's principles, though perhaps not quite in the manner their originator intended." As Miss Marple made her way upstairs, she paused to observe how the setting sun created a complex pattern of reflections between the study window and the garden house. Someone else was watching too, a figure barely glimpsed in the play of light across glass, there and gone like smoke in mirrors. Tomorrow, she knew, that same light would reveal not just the method of Edward Dunbar's murder, but the true face of his killer. It was simply a matter of ensuring everyone was positioned correctly when the final illusion was shattered. In her room, Miss Marple carefully locked away the documents she had discovered. The stage was set, the players positioned. All that remained was to illuminate the truth in the most literal sense possible. Chapter 8. Clear Reflection. The study at Ravenscrest Manor stood prepared for Miss Marple's curious gathering, its mirrors positioned with mathematical precision. Inspector Slack, stationed by the window with ill-concealed impatience, consulted his timepiece. "Nearly 4 o'clock, he announced with evident disdain, "though I cannot fathom why we must endure this theatrical display, Miss Marple." "Patience, Inspector," Miss Marple replied serenely. "I dare say you shall find the afternoon most illuminating. Might I suggest you take a seat in Edward's chair? The perspective, I assure you, is rather essential to our purpose." Lady Patricia occupied a seat near the fireplace, while Margaret Dunbar stood rather stiffly by the door. Collins had arranged the tea service with his customary exactitude, each silver piece catching the strengthening sunlight. Thomas Fletcher lingered near the door, his weathered hands clasping not only the velvet-wrapped mirror, but also a small glass vial. "Now then," Miss Marple began, as the grandfather clock in the hall struck 4, "I believe we are about to witness a most remarkable demonstration of Sebastian Vale's final illusion, though not, I fear, in the manner he intended." She gestured to Fletcher, who carefully unwrapped the mirror and positioned it precisely as directed. "And the vial, if you please, Mr. Fletcher." "Found it just where you said it would be, miss," Fletcher stated, presenting the small bottle. "Hidden behind them old mirrors in the garden house." "Epinephrine," Miss Marple pronounced clearly, holding the vial to the light. "More commonly known as adrenaline. When administered in precise quantities, it produces the most alarming effects upon the heart." Collins moved to pour the tea, but Miss Marple raised her hand. "Oh no, Mr. Collins. Or should I say, Mr. Vale, I believe your expertise with such preparations has already been quite thoroughly demonstrated." The butler's composure flickered for only a moment. "I'm sure I don't take your meaning, miss. Don't you?" "How curious. For I find it most interesting that Sebastian Vale's grandson should choose to serve in the very house where his grandfather's greatest illusion was to be performed. Though you improved upon it considerably, didn't you, adding a rather modern pharmaceutical element to the theatrical effect?" Inspector Slack, seated in Edward's chair, shifted uncomfortably. "This is pure conjecture." "Inspector," Miss Marple interrupted with gentle authority, "might I direct your attention to the mirror before you? The angle of the sun is most crucial at this precise moment." As the words left her lips, The sunlight struck the arranged mirrors at exactly 4 o'clock. Inspector Slack's reflection appeared oddly truncated. His head seemingly vanished while his body remained visible. A collective gasp filled the room. Lady Patricia clutched her throat. Good heavens! The exact effect poor Edward witnessed in his final moments, Miss Marple explained, though his heart, already racing from the administered epinephrine, could not withstand the shock. Rather ingenious, combining modern medicine with Victorian illusion. The perfect murder, a natural death, apparently alone in a locked room. Collins remained perfectly still, though his reflection trembled slightly in the nearest mirror. As I said, miss. But you had already planned your revenge, Miss Marple continued, using your grandfather's principles of optical deception, combined with your knowledge of modern pharmaceuticals. The mirrors in this house aren't merely decorative, are they? Each one positioned to create what Sebastian Vale called the murderer's mirror, an illusion designed to stop a heart. Margaret gasped. The magic show last summer, you were testing the angles. Indeed. Miss Marple nodded. Poor Alice Bennet discovered this by accident while cleaning the mirrors. She saw the effect, didn't she? And realized what it meant about Edward's death. Collins moved with startling speed toward the door, but stopped abruptly as Inspector Slack drew his service revolver. The butler's refined mask crumbled entirely. He would have sold everything, he snarled. My grandfather's life's work, his final illusion, all of it up for auction to pay his gambling debts. I couldn't allow it. The epinephrine was merely insurance. The real art was in the illusion itself. And poor Alice Bennet? Lady Patricia asked, her voice shaking. She saw what she shouldn't have, just like Edward, trying to recreate the illusion without understanding its true purpose. Collins laughed bitterly. My grandfather died trying to perfect this trick. How fitting that his grandson should finally make it work, with a little help from modern science. Inspector Slack, who had been consistently wrong throughout the investigation, moved forward awkwardly to make the arrest. He cleared his throat uncomfortably. I suppose, Miss Marple, I owe you an apology. Oh, no, Inspector, Miss Marple replied mildly. You simply failed to look at the reflections from the proper angle, though in future you might consider that age and seeming harmlessness can often conceal the keenest of observers. She gazed out the window toward the garden house, where Sebastian Vale had once practiced his illusions. You know, in many ways, this case rather reminds me of a truth I've often observed. The most dangerous deceptions are those we perform upon ourselves. The morning after Collins's arrest found Miss Marple taking tea with Lady Patricia in Ravenscrest Manor's morning room, where a cheerful fire had been lit to ward off the autumn chill. Upon my word, Jane, Lady Patricia remarked, her aristocratic bearing somewhat restored, I find myself utterly confounded by your perspicacity in this matter. How came you to connect Collins with Sebastian Vale? The document I discovered in your library proved most illuminating, Miss Marple replied, accepting a second cup of Darjeeling. A playbill, you see, advertising Vale's final performance. But it was Sir Henry's telegram that provided the crucial detail about the family name. Ah, dear Sebastian Vale, Lady Patricia's eyes grew distant. I suppose I ought to tell you the full history, as it was related to me by my dear papa. Vale was, in his day, the most celebrated illusionist in all of Europe. His performances at the Egyptian Hall in Piccadilly drew the finest of society. But it was his mirror illusions that truly set him apart. She paused to adjust her lace cuff with precise movements. He purchased Ravenscrest Manor in 1865, you see, using it to perfect what he called his symphonies of reflection. The house's very architecture was modified to accommodate his experiments with light and mirrors. And the final illusion? Miss Marple prompted gently. The murderer's mirror, yes, Vale had discovered something extraordinary about the relationship between light, reflection, and the human mind. But before he could perform it, there was that dreadful business with his creditors. The family lost everything. Lady Patricia's voice took on a note of discomfort. I believe my grandfather may have been somewhat opportunistic in his acquisition of the property during that period, which explains Collins's desire for revenge, Miss Marple observed. Sir Henry's investigation revealed that Vale's grandson had changed the family name to Collins after a scandal in Brighton involving a similar mirror trick. Most enlightening. But how did you know to request Sir Henry's assistance in the first place? The theatrical notices in the morning paper mentioned an auction of Vale's effects. The timing seemed rather significant, particularly given Collins's excessive attention to the positioning of mirrors. Miss Marple set her cup down with delicate precision. Sir Henry was able to access certain records from the Brighton incident that confirmed my suspicions about Collins's true identity. Lady Patricia drew herself up with regal determination. My dear Jane, you simply must allow me to offer some token of my gratitude, a cheque, perhaps. Oh, no, my dear, Miss Marple interjected with gentle firmness. I couldn't possibly accept remuneration for what was, after all, merely an exercise in observation. Though I dare say, she added with the faintest twinkle in her eye, I should not object to the occasional invitation to tea, particularly when your gardens are in bloom. You shall always be most welcome at Ravenscrest, Lady Patricia declared warmly. Then, with a slight shudder, though I believe I shall have the majority of these mirrors removed, one can have rather too many reflections, I find. A most sensible notion, Miss Marple agreed, for as I have often observed, the truest reflections are those we see not in glass, but in the consequences of our actions. Poor Collins might have done well to remember that before attempting to combine his grandfather's theatrical genius with modern pharmaceutical science. Lady Patricia raised a perfectly arched eyebrow. I must say the idea of using a mirror trick to induce cardiac failure seems rather elaborate. The elaborate nature of the crime was precisely what revealed its author, Miss Marple replied. Only someone with both intimate knowledge of Vale's principles and a theatrical sense of justice would devise such a method. Collins wished not merely to kill Edward, but to do so in a manner that would validate his grandfather's final illusion. How providential that you were here to perceive the truth, Lady Patricia murmured, her aristocratic composure softening into genuine warmth. Miss Marple accepted another cup of the excellent Darjeeling with a gentle smile. One can only hope, she said softly, watching the firelight dance across the delicate bone china, that as I have often observed, sometimes the truest reflection is found not in glass, but in the human heart. Thank you for tuning in to Cafe Stories. If you enjoyed the intrigue and suspense, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon to stay updated on more captivating detective adventures. Your support keeps the stories coming and the mysteries alive.